start.
Yes.
Are you recording?
Okay. So when you are ready, I am ready.
Yeah.
Welcome tonight. We are so glad to have two writers to reflect in their books of the meaning of life, emotional family ties, motherhood, loss, grief, and the possibilities of building and shaping lineage and familiar constellations as acts of resistance, self-preservation, and love. Becoming a Matriarch is a moving, deep memoir about a woman, Helen Knott, that's correct, a member of the Danza people. In her book, she opened her ancestral knowledge to us about how through generations, birth, love, sovereignty, desire, resistance, illness, healing, and loss is living in a personal, familiar, and community ways beyond the West framework. In the other hand, Tamarin Norwood guides us through the song of the whole wide world in a personal journey to dealing with the loss of her baby Gabriel after hours born. The partner, the little son, the midwife, the grandma, and her sister are protagonists of this story of loss, grief, hope, and don't give it up to continue strong and fragile at the same time. Well, we are ready to listen both of you to read part of your books. So, you are welcome, please.
That's very kind for letting me go first. So I'd like to just read a page and a half from the opening chapter, because this is something that kept coming back to me as I was reading Helen's beautiful book, because it speaks about the place where we are and the landscape and our relationship to the land. So we just moved house and we woke up on the first morning of our new house. We woke in the morning to thick fog all around, as though the night had turned pale while we were asleep. In shoes that slipped and let in cold, we set out to explore. The ground revealed itself in patches as we followed the track through the fog, past where the hills and the orchard must have been, over the stiles and the cattle grid and flat stone bridge, the soil frozen hard, long grasses clumped with frost and pressed down by leaves disintegrating and sparkling white. Again we found we were whispering. We followed the track through a weighted gate where two rope fences led the way between sloping paddocks, and with the clap of the gate horror came. Breath that sounded hot and dark from lungs much too big, and then hooves much too close, and I felt for Anatol's little gloved hand and I pulled him near. Then two horses, three, rose from the fog, tails flicking, and were away. Anton put Anatol on his shoulders after that, and we retreated from the paddocks, singing a slow and boisterous rhyme, pitch all out of kilter, until he was settled again. Gig and pony, trotting along the way. The rhyme took us along a bitten tarmac path to where a homely church stood waiting. The low square tower and all the walls familiar with the stone of our house and the garden wall. We stopped singing, and the lovely silence came as a reproach for all our noise. And when we spoke after that, every word uttered into the cold air made a daring claim upon the place. We belong here too. We are new, and this land is very old, and we are here. But now we know that this is Gabriel's land. His is the churchyard, his the hills and the trees and all they bear, his the gleaming pips and the dark in the lungs of the beasts, his the shattering ice and snow, the song, the cold, and all the secrets of the ground.
Thank you so much. That's very moving. And now, Helen, can you share with us?
In my early 20s, we went on a family road trip to Calgary and Banff. Our caravan of 3 vehicles drove in the vicinity of the speed limit, sometimes leapfrogging one another as we made our way down the highway, and sometimes pulling over at rest stops at the mercy of children's bladders. And when we stopped, We made bologna sandwiches and handed out cold drinks from a cooler in the back of a minivan. Then the passengers would pile into a different car than they'd been riding in before. There were aunties, brothers, toddlers, and of course, there was Grandma. We visited the Calgary Zoo for the first and only time. We moved through it together as a singular, giant, and loud Indigenous entity. As the kids played in one location and the adults rested under the shade of a tree, I noticed that Grandma had not moved from her spot for some time. She had been standing in front of the black bear enclosure for almost 15 minutes. The hot sun shone down on her black hair, which had never taken to turning gray. "What are you looking at?" I asked her, and she pointed her finger at the bear, who was repeating a pattern of movement. 2 steps forward, a circling of the head, 2 steps back. 2 steps forward, a circling of the head, 2 steps back. "His mind is gone," she said sadly as she raised her hand to her head and moved it outward in front of her to emphasize the bear's fleeing sanity. Grandma was raised in the bush and was not unfamiliar with bears. She traversed land all alone as a young girl, often taking a kettle and tea into the middle of nowhere for an afternoon. Grandma had seen stretches of our Denizah territory that I haven't yet been through as an adult. She stood in the hot sun for another 10 minutes, watching. The bear did not break the sequence. People ate ice cream while offering their kids their first glimpse of the wild. A big black bear with a lost mind, stuck in a small man-made home. And I wonder if Grandma saw herself in that bear. Something wild, something trapped, something committed to pattern and memory, something that longed to be free but never would be. I have been learning to hold memory without carrying the weight of it. And there are days when I feel liberated and days when I wish my body was full of forgetfulness. I am the black bear. I am the spectator. I am the oblivious child eating ice cream. I am all these things. I am named Helen, after my kokum who raised my dad. My middle name is June, after it's Sue. I carry the names of the women who came before me. I was aged with memory the day I was born.
Oh, so powerful. Thank you so much, all of you, for sharing these powerful statements as well. Well, in both books, I find a strong recognition of your mothers, and in your case, about your grandma. Can you tell us how both of you find the mother and motherhood as a resource to build your work as a writer? As a writers?
Can you ask me again?
Yes, of course. Can you tell us how you find the mother and motherhood as a resource to build or craft your work as a writer?
My grandmother, Mayatsu, she was an amazing storyteller, and I loved watching her body become the story as she told story. She would tell a story about a bird, and the bird would be here, and then would fly down and land in front of you. And so growing up with storytelling, not only in that format, but my aunties who were second mums to me. And so we are Denizah, but on the Cree side, the word for auntie actually translates to little mother, like little mom. So they are your mom, right? They're an extension of that. And just growing up around women who had so many stories to tell. And my mom would throw on a pot of coffee, and all of the women would gather around the table, and just being able to listen to them. And for me, story was always an access point to their experiences, to the worlds that they lived in, and story feels like home to me. It's memory. It's something very comforting. If someone tells me stories, it feels I'm a cat in the sunlight, and I can just curl up. So I think storytelling has that, like they've inspired that in me, but it also is a place like I turn to rest in as well because of them.
Yeah, I think because the orality have such a power to impact our lives.
Yeah.
What about you?
Such a lovely question, and I've never really thought about it before. So I think where stories run between me and my mother and my daughter is not in words as much as in doing things, and specifically what we call cutting and sticking, like sitting at a kitchen table, like doing a bit of craft and doing things like that. But that kind of close touch and that closeness of kind of knowing how to make things work with our hands. My mother has that, and I have that, and my daughter has that. And there is such a strong lineage from her to me to her in that way. And it's not actually stories in words, and it's not only kind of cutting and sticking at the kitchen table, but it's this kind of closeness to, it sounds, the kind of closeness to the materiality of the world and the stuff, what stuff is, you know, and somehow that tells its own story, and it's not quite a story, you know, it's not a story with a narrative, it's not a story with kind of an arc or a story-like shape, but it's a kind of, I don't really know how to describe it, it's a kind of being in the world, it has a character and a kind of feel, there's a quality of light to it, you know, so I think there is a lineage of story that's made of stuff running in our family through the women.
Yeah. I had this conversation with someone the other week where we just talked about the way that storytelling shows up in our lives. And it's not just through orality or through writing, but through things that we make, things that we do. It is through action that it shows up in all of these beautiful ways. So thank you for highlighting that.
Yeah, definitely. In your book, I can see more the orality, like a resource for craft your story, your memoir. But in your case, more this materiality, because you begin your book talking about this experience with your mother.
Cutting
with
the hair.
Exactly,
Yes.
and for this reason was for me very, very interesting. Ask about that. Okay, I think now we are in the second question. Could you tell us about your creative process as a no-fiction writer? That's very interesting because both of you are not writing, or in this case, they are memories. They are part of your personal biography life. So what do you think about your creative process to be as a no-fiction writer?
Well, I've often, you know what, this question interests me so much because people often ask me how I've written my book. And I always say the same thing, and I'm going to see if I can say something a bit different this time, because what I always say is that I started off just splurging grief onto the page. I mean, it's true what I always say, splurging grief onto the page in a kind of diary, unedited, just with no plan. Then time goes on, and I found that I could express better and better and better that kind of splurge of grief. I could actually get closer to what it meant to me the more I worked into the writing, made it more and more and more and more detailed. And that's absolutely true, but it feels like and I wonder if I thought this partly because I'm reading your book as well, but there's something of an essay form that I think is happening in my book, and it's a trying out of ideas and setting up maybe one image or one sort of system of ideas that group together. And I think, all right, I think I've got a handle on this kind of relationship of ideas. This is like this and that's like that, and if I put them together they mean this. So that's an essay. And then it happens again, and it happens again, and I felt that it was going to be a book because there were a lot of these chained ideas that had relationships. Then it was a question of, well, how do you make this into a book that works as a kind of chronology? And I decided to go for a very, very simple chronological chapter by chapter account, but actually I almost thought, I'll just sort of send it off as a chronology, but I felt like really I should probably make it more interpretive, but in the end I'm very pleased that I left it as a kind of chronology, because it was just a series of essays that kind of landed in chronological form, is how I felt. But yeah, I don't know, I think there's lots more to think about that process. Tell me about yours, Helen.
Yeah, I needed structure, because otherwise I feel like I'm writing into an abyss and then I stop writing at a certain point. So I created a structure, but it was basically like gathering ideas around something and seeing what would go in there, and then allowing yourself to be flexible within it, because you can have an idea of what something's meant to be, but it will also ask to become what it wants to, and you have to be able and willing to follow that. So I found that was a part of it. Another part of my process, especially for this book, because it was about like my mom and my grandma, is like every time I sat down to write in the mornings, I would be like, okay girls, like I need you to show up with me, and you're invited into this process, and you're gonna help me write this. And there's a quote from Julia Cameron's book, and then I just used the word creator, but it was like, creator, I'll take care of the quantity if you take care of the quality. So my only job was to show up every day, and the quality would be up to something greater than myself. But it was like, even in terms of emotions, right? So when you're writing something that's charged, it was a lot of like really hardcore emotions, sometimes like upset or pity or whatever it was, and then you return to it, and then it's kind of like the smoothing out of like a stone, where you're like rubbing it over and over again and refining it until it becomes something that will like maybe catch the sunlight, and being able to put that in something, and having that process with it, and being gentle with yourself and full of grace. I think some days I would open up and then be crying within 5 minutes, and I'd be like, okay, like we're not writing today. Yeah.
That's very interesting. Thank you. The next question is, where did you draw direct inspiration from? Were there any books, music, places, pictures, and other stories that inspired you to write this book?
There's a song by The Blaze called Queens, and I am, like, if I'm writing, I will put on one song and it'll be on repeat for that entire, like, writing session. So sometimes it'll be, like, repetitive. So there was a whole chunk of this book that was written to The Blaze Queens, like, over and over and over again. And so that song still is paired with this book in my mind. And I think that was one of the things for me, is just having that consistent soundtrack when I'm writing. Depending on what it was, if it was like a memory, then maybe I'd put on a song for a little bit from like that era, so I can kind of sit in that moment, because you're looking for the memories, right? And it's such a like a like 5 sense process, right?
Like a ritual. This is part of your ritual as a writer.
Yeah, and I think it's preparing for those memories, and sometimes like having that, for me, that little bit of ceremony in it as well, whether that be going and like laying an offering, or so we smudge, which is like burning a medicine for like cleansing and clearing. So sometimes I'm like smudging, and then I'll like smudge my laptop down and make sure everything's like clean and cleansed, and just preparing to go into space for that day.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
What about you?
I think it's rich, honestly. That's a wonderful image, the smudging there. But well, I suppose I didn't have music on, couldn't have music on, because so I think in a way my answer to this story is almost as little as possible. So I would, because there's a lot of the time I would really need to be not reading, because the voices become very contagious to me. I remember there was point I had to stop reading Helen Sissou at all, because you read something, you write like you're reading, and I think also something I learned over many years working as an artist is that there's a terrible danger of replicating the theory you're reading by making practice that effectively illustrates the theory and the critique. And I learned, and I saw a lot of this happening as an artist, as people kind of tool up and do their PhDs or do their masters. You're reading more and more critical theory, you're reading more and more criticism, you're reading more and more art history. and your actual art practice ends up kind of illustrating theory. And I think practice sometimes needs to come first and be a path-breaking force against the unknown, you know. So I was conscious that I was cautious to be reading anything that was really similar, that was really dealing with the same stuff. Because I thought that it's not that I thought I could do it any better or any worse, but that I didn't think there was anything useful about being guided by what I could already find. But at the same time, so that's a kind of, there was a big disinterest or reluctance to read things that were very, very close. But at the same time, obviously, there's a lot of references to a lot of reading that I was doing, and there's a lot of reading that I'd previously done that I refer to in the book, and a lot of reading that I did in order to write the book. But these were always thematic, you know, to learn, to understand about, you know, like I really read some Rilke poetry, and obviously Dante, and I read a lot about, you know, the history of sparrows in theological paintings and Bede, and so there's an awful lot of reading I did, but I really was not interested in reading other books about, say, baby loss, or other books about grief, or other books about how people get through bereavement, because that's what I was doing, and I thought I could contribute best to that conversation by feeling my way blindly through, and then coming up and saying, all right, well, this is what I've got. So yeah, that's right.
Yeah, it's very interesting listening both of you, because actually part of the books that I read recently, they are as well memoir or biographic stuff, but they are experiment with different kind of approach to the topics, and sometimes they are hybrid writings. So you can find in the same book poetry, flash fiction, or some reference from another works, and this kind of stuff. But your work basically is clean of this influence. But now when you are listening, or when you are sharing with us all the work that is behind, I can understand properly. But as well, I can find in both books the use of the poetry language or symbolic ways there. And this is so powerful. For example, to talk about the territory and the comparison, for example, that you are doing, Helen, in your book, in the first page about the body with the territory. This is so powerful, but as well is very poetic. And the way that you are telling us the loss of Gabriel, and when your mother, your sister, they go with you for consolation, is very poetic as well. What do you think about the power of the poetry in your own work?
I think that, I suppose I want to connect it back to that cutting and sticking somehow. I think there's some way in which you can get ideas to become objects that you can show to be doing things, that you can look at them. And if you can make ideas into things that you can look at, then you're likely to be able to turn them around in your hand and look at them in new ways, get the light to shine through them in different ways, you know? And I think poetry kind of reifies ideas as it makes them into things. So I think I find poetic imagery very useful, because it just makes thoughts usefully helpful.
I'm just like, oh, that's such good imagery. Poetry was my first love. Like, that was like the first time I fell in love with words. This is the song by Erykah Badu called Love of My Life, and it's an ode to hip hop. And that song is like me, but poetry. So we go way back. And for me, I remember in my first book, like trying to incorporate poetry, and I was very like, it was very abrupt. Like I would introduce the poem and everything, because I was like, how do I do this within memoir? And so it wasn't seamless. It was like it's an interesting transition. And then I was doing some academic work, and I remember working with the editor, and she's like, let's put your poetry in this. I was like, in academic work? And she's like, yeah, let's do it. I was like, okay. So we started doing it, and she helped me, funny enough that it was through that process, but she helped me be comfortable with putting poetry wherever I wanted to see it. And I was like, okay, we can do this in this way. And so with this book, I think I took more liberty of being like, okay, we're going to off-road here. We're going to incorporate it here. And that was a way to like merge my first love with writing nonfiction.
Well, I have another question, and I think we can open the space for the public. Is how do the themes of structure of the native matriarchy transpire or integrate into other societal structures? Do you feel there is tension or resistance in understanding this? Because, for example, in your book, I can see all your knowledge, all your wisdom, and as well in a very specific context that sometimes when we try to translate to another context, sometimes it's not matching, especially in West societies. The question is in both ways. What do you think, how you can integrate, for example, her knowledge and this experience in your work, and as well how you can integrate the Tamarin work in your process as a writer, and as well because basically both of you have very similar topics in your books. What do you think the challenge and breaks that we can have?
I have a you ready to answer?
No.
I'm still thinking. I feel that there is something about the relationship with the landscape and the relationship with what we know and how we form that knowledge. Because it seems to me that in both our books there's a kind of emergency going on in which we need stories that we either do or do not in various different ways have access to. And what can we do to try to force these stories to come into being and serve us in the way that we need them to serve us? And I suppose my first reaction reading your book, well, towards the beginning of it, I was thinking, my God, like I've got nothing, because you've got this amazing kind of rich ancestral heritage of stories, you know, and my family history, it's like abruptly stops. My knowledge of my family history kind of abruptly stops at my parents, for very, you know, there's just no sense of continuity, and so I don't have an inbuilt thing that I'm searching in me and in my ancestry for. So I've searched for it. I think where my book is making up stories, it's forcing together, you know, the poetry and I think there's a little bit of a right back, because I think that somehow the priests and the poets and the doctors and the midwives and the mystics are all kind of convening their knowledge, kind of like rivers convene to provide me with the meaning that I'm demanding from the world somehow. But this is why I'm really, really interested to hear what you have to say, because I felt like, well, where does creativity come in? Am I making up? Am I the one convening these stories and giving them meaning because I need them now? Or am I kind of finding them from the world, you know, dredging them up from the soil or dredging them from books? Am I making them or am I finding them? And I feel like you're going to have such interesting things to say about what, you know, are you making your stories or are you finding your stories? Anyway, that's where I am with that. And I suppose to answer your question probably is, so I feel like if we're learning from each other's books,
exactly,
that's such a rich place we could learn from I don't know if we learn from each other, but like put our ideas together.
Yeah, even I was thinking about the passage that you read where you were talking about, so it was like describing space and place and your connection to it, but also your connection to Gabriel through that space and place. And there was like a line in mine where I was talking about like how my mom's like, she's no longer here in a physical plane, but her like body unfurled and gave itself back to the land, and then she was the land, and that's how I experienced closeness, was through space and place. And then is it like something that gives a story? I always think that, you know, I was told by a drummer, so he's like a traditional hand drummer back from one of the communities, and he said, you know, the way that we have this like interaction with song is that we're told that song will travel the world until someone is ready to listen and to bring it into the world. And I was like, that's what it feels like with story. That story is like waiting for someone, and it's like tapping the shoulder, being like, hey, I need to come in. So I think it's this convergence of like our experiences, everything that's happening to us. And I ask people, I'm like, do you feel that sometimes where it's like this like energy around you where you're like, there's something here, right? And you have, it's your job to kind of like lasso it and pull it into the world. So you end up being the conduit who makes meaning, but it's there like as this entity waiting to come into the world. So it's a process of like something willing to show, or something showing up, but then also being willing to listen, to pull it all together and bring it through. So is it like then a two-part process?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And I can see, this is my last intervention, I can see in both books that the partner, in your case, and your father, they are very big characters in your books. So it's very interesting because in the majority of the memoir that we have, especially in topics like that, the men, they are no part of the narrative of the story. But you basically go and take them and you put them and you put in a very, very sensitive way that open the conversation about another kind of masculinity. And you humanize the men and the men around you. That's very powerful. So what do you think about continuing this way to explore more the fragility, not just to be a woman, to be a matriarch, or to be a mother, but as well to be a human being, especially in situations when the life is in risk?
I just kind of like go back to the teaching that one elder gave me, and it was like, we journey as one. And she's like, the men walked ahead of us because they broke trail. And she's like, it's not because they knew where we were going better, but they made it easier for us to journey. And so our footprints were like aligned with each other. And just remembering at the time, like how upset I was about some of that, because she's like, we need to create space for them. She said, because our women, especially Indigenous women in Canada, when like colonization happened, and for like all of the policies, all of the things that happened that kept our people in one place, like it was called the pass system. So you would need a pass to leave the reservation. And so you were stuck on like small parcels, right? You couldn't go hunt, the men couldn't work properly. So their role was kind of like gone. And so women really like stepped to the forefront in terms of like maintaining families, like putting the hard work in. But she was like, where is the space for our men? And I remember feeling very upset by, like, because I was like, what do you mean? I've had to like pull this slack. And so a big part of it has been like healing work around that, around, you know, we both have inherited these broken systems. We're both in these roles trying to do acts of care that aren't necessarily like the best ways, right? They kind of like recontribute to this like broken system of communal care. And how do we find a way forward together? Because we want to make it together, right? It's like, okay, let's see what we can see over here, and what does this look like, and what does this feel like? And also being very conscious of the fact that I'm raising a son, and wanting to raise him and uphold him in the best way that I can as his mother. And that also comes through my relationship with, and showing him what that looks like in not only our families, but within our communities as well, and how his role is to be expressed.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.